Good morning. Call this hearing to order. Thank you for all being here today as we assess how our nation is doing at building out broadband services to our rural areas. And do not let lack of attendance here indicate to you in any way lack of interest. As Ranking Member Schneider and I were just saying, it's a very, very busy day and a lot of things going on this morning. So everybody, maybe more so than usual, are pulled in multiple directions. But rest assured, it is a very serious issue, and I'm from a rural district, and it is talked about every time I'm back in the state of Iowa. As we've all witnessed in the last decade, modern communications technology has provided endless opportunities to small businesses, and particularly new and exciting ones to small firms located in rural America. The growth of the telecommunications industry and the advances in the way we communicate with each other in recent history has been nothing less than astonishing. Because of this rapid advancement, we have seen a revolution of sorts for small businesses as well. Small firms can communicate now with potential buyers around the world. Family farmers are using wireless technologies to monitor and maximize their crop production. Entrepreneurs can launch a website or an application from their living room or from just about anywhere. And I own a small technology company, and we sell around the world, and we couldn't do it without the internet. And with the use of now commonplace smartphone, we can accept payments from just about anywhere there is a wireless signal. Most importantly, these new technologies provide the gateway and opportunity for economic growth and job creation, particularly in the rural areas. One of the most important tools the internet offers to small business is the ability to access the national and global electronic marketplace. From 2005 to 2015, electronic commerce in the United States, also known as online sales, grew from $291 billion to $342 billion. It's an average increase of 15.3% from 2012 to 2015, phenomenal growth. And this will not slow down anytime soon, I'm sure you would agree. Our small businesses, particularly ones in rural areas, depend on new telecommunications technologies to compete across town and across the world. Our witnesses today represent a critical part of the infrastructure that allows them to do just that. The nation's small telecommunications providers are the ones that traditionally supply the bulk of broadband services to the most rural parts of America, and that is no easy task. For instance, it is certainly worth the investment when you connect broadband to a densely populated urban area with homes, apartments, businesses, and people all converging in a relatively small area. It's not uncommon to have hundreds, if not thousands, of potential subscribers in a 1 square mile area. In rural areas, where family farms dot the landscape, acres and acres and acres apart from each other, in towns of populations of 300 representing the center of the community, the bang for the investment isn't quite as large. Unfortunately, this simple geographic fact of population density has led to a rather large disparity of 39% of our rural Americans not having access to high-speed telecommunications capacity, 39%, compared to only 4% of Americans who live in urban areas. We've been making progress over the past few years, but more needs to be done to put rural America on par with urban America. This issue is double-edged sword in that we have small telecommunications companies serving the greater rural small business sector at large with no small responsibility. We here in Congress must ensure that our federal government's regulatory regime is supporting and fostering growth in the telecommunications industry, not penalizing and limiting as we have seen in recent years. We have a new administration and new leadership at the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, as most of us know it by, and other regulatory bodies that have a significant say about how and when broadband services can be delivered to rural areas in the United States, and I remain hopeful for continued positive change. Again, I want to thank everyone for being here, particularly our panelists, and I now yield to our ranking member, Mr. Snyder, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome the Chairman of the Overall Small Business Committee, Mr. Shabbat. I'm pleased to join you both at this very important hearing today. Technology is a major contributor to the U.S. economy and the engine for modern American economic growth. Last year alone, the Internet created 10.4 million jobs across all 50 states and contributed to 6% of the total U.S. GDP, $1.2 trillion. At a time when technology holds the key to remaining competitive in a globalized economy, it is worrisome that the United States is ranked number 16 in the world in broadband access. Let me repeat that. The United States is ranked 16th in the world in broadband access. For those of us fortunate enough to have access to broadband, we've seen the benefits of technology and how it affects our daily lives. From being able to make decisions based on real-time data to being able to work remotely from any location, internet access has changed the face of business. Yet 34 million Americans still lack access to high-speed internet, 39% of which live in rural communities. This is simply unacceptable. Even though broadband subscriptions have progressively increased, rural and low-income community access is being outpaced by the rest of the country due to a lack of network deployment. Unfortunately, the digital divide may further widen without adequate support for broadband deployment. The truth is that expanding access in hard-to-reach and sparsely populated areas usually comes with a high price tag and significant challenges. The government plays a large role in ensuring all Americans have access to 21st century technology, and that's why we're holding this hearing, to learn just how we in Congress can improve broadband adoption. Eliminating the digital divide will not only assist rural communities, it will help our nation's job creators. By enabling small business access to the global electronic marketplace, we encourage job creation and innovation. Thus far, federal loan and grant programs have helped rural communities gain access to high-speed internet, but we need to do more. Substantial and direct funding to improve broadband nationally is critical to enabling both small telecom carriers and small consumers to thrive. In the wake of a larger infrastructure package, we have an enormous opportunity to upgrade America's digital blueprint. We must harness the potential of robust technologies and find the sweet spot between government oversight and technological advancements, all without hindering business opportunities. I look forward to today's discussion on improving broadband access in order to strengthen rural communities and small businesses. The insights gathered today will allow us to evaluate the performance of the FCC in supporting network deployment. I would like to thank all of the witnesses for being here today and providing us your insight. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
I'd now like to explain opening statements, how that works, and timing. If committee members have an opening statement prepared, I ask that it be submitted for the record. I'd like to take a moment to explain, once again, the timing lights for you. You'll each have 5 minutes to deliver your testimony. The light will start out as green. When you have 1 minute remaining, it will turn to yellow. And finally, at the end of your 5 minutes, it will turn to red. And we ask that you please try to the best of your ability, adhere to that time frame. Now I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel today. Our first witness today is Mike Romano, Senior Vice President of Industry Affairs and Business Development for NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. In this role, he directs public policy, government affairs, business opportunities, and community initiatives for the nearly 850 small rural telecommunications providers it serves. Mr. Romano previously worked with the Bingham McCutcheon Law Firm and has had a diverse range of positions within the telecommunications industry, including founding vice president and general counsel of GTT Communications, following a merger between Global Internetworking Incorporated and European Technologies and Telecommunications. He's also held various positions with America Online and Level 3 Communications. And thank you for being here with us today, Mr. Romano. Our next witness is Dave Osborne, CEO of VTX1 in Raymondville, Texas, testifying on behalf of the WTA, Advocates for Rural Broadband. Mr. Osborne has been in his current position for 12 years, prior to which he had already worked in the telecommunication industry, holding various positions with multiple companies for more than 4 decades. Mr. Osborne began his career in the industry in 1970 with Southwestern Bell in Dallas, Texas, eventually climbing the corporate ladder to find himself at AT&T's corporate headquarters in Morristown, New Jersey in the mid-1980s. He is now at his current position at VTX1 and also sits on the board of directors of the WTA. Thank you for being here with us today, Mr. Osborne. Up next is Tim Donovan, Senior Vice President of Legislative Affairs for the Competitive Carriers Association, otherwise known as the CCA. We have a lot of acronyms in Washington, D.C., that's for sure. Mr. Donovan previously served as Manager of Government Affairs for the Direct Marketing Association, where he's responsible for supporting the advocacy goals of the direct marketing community. In his current capacity, Mr. Donovan is tasked with presenting the association's legislative advocacy before policymakers on issues impacting wireless telecommunications providers, including broadband deployment, universal service, access to spectrum, devices, broadband policy, roaming, and other issues that affect the policy of these carriers. Does everyone understand all of that? Thank you for being here with us today, Mr. Donovan. And now you yield to Ranking Member Snyder for the introduction of our final witness.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Chris Allendorf. Mr. Allendorf has served as the Vice President of External Relations and General Counsel for Joe Carroll Energy since 2015. Joe Carroll Electric Cooperative is located in my home state of Illinois and was founded with the goal of bringing electricity to rural residents not reached by investor-owned utilities. Since then, the cooperative has transformed to meet the needs of rural communities in modern times by providing other essential services, including broadband internet. Mr. Allendorf has transitioned from corporate counsel to other roles in the cooperative. As general counsel, Mr. Allendorf oversees legal and regulatory matters involving the cooperative's 3 business areas: electric, natural gas, and broadband internet. Mr. Allendorf also oversees the cooperative's economic development initiatives. Mr. Allendorf holds a BS degree from Western Illinois University and receives his JD from Northern Illinois University in 2012. Mr. Allendorf is a lifelong resident of rural Northwest Illinois. He also serves on the board of the Galena Area Chamber of Commerce and the Tri-County Economic Development Alliance. Welcome, Mr. Allendorf.
Very good. Very good. Thank you, Mr. Snyder. And now I'd like to recognize our first witness, Mike Romano, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Schneider, and members of the subcommittee for the chance to testify on the importance of rural broadband to the U.S. economy and how sound policies can promote the deployment and sustainability of broadband in rural America. NTCA's 850 members are small businesses, most based in the rural communities they serve. They rose to the original challenge of unserved areas, answering the call and getting telephone service at the time to rural America. Today, these small businesses and cooperatives deliver cutting-edge broadband critical to the well-being of rural America, translating into economic development and job creation. And the payback of these investments comes in economic activity that accrues mostly to the benefit of urban areas. Small rural carriers have led the charge in deploying future-proof networks, with 71% of their customers having access to 25 megabits down speed that the FCC has defined as the access standard today. But there's much more to do, with the remaining customers being harder to reach, and with many rural areas served by other providers suffering from an even greater lack of access. And even where networks are built, the job isn't done. It's not just about the one-time act of getting broadband out there. It makes little sense to declare victory if the service is too expensive or if the network can't keep pace with consumer demand. Unfortunately, the business of rural broadband is hardly a money-making proposition. Distance, density, and topography undercut the business case in rural America. This is why direct support from the High-Cost Universal Service Fund is essential. Without sufficient USF, it is difficult, if not impossible, to justify rural broadband loans or to charge reasonable rates for rural service. USF is perhaps the best example of a public-private partnership in the broadband space, having helped to justify construction loans and private network investments that total tens of billions of dollars today. But the USF program has been badly damaged. While the FCC took much-needed steps to update the program last year, the reforms also revealed more clearly than ever how insufficient the Universal Service Fund is. A flat budget in place since 2011 that is now enforced by a firm control will deny $173 million in USF support for small rural carriers over the next 12 months. That's $173 million for broadband investments already made, forcing them to respond by hiking rural consumer rates, cutting jobs, and slamming the brakes on future investments. The fact that the budget control changes unpredictably only further undermines their ability to borrow or invest in long-term network assets. A survey that NTCA just completed and that we'll actually be releasing today indicates that 2/3 of our members are pulling back on investments because of this problem, translating potentially to hundreds of millions of dollars in suspended investments and possibly hundreds of thousands of rural Americans locked in at lower speeds. Tack on another $110 million in shortfalls to fund a support model the FCC developed last year, and this translates to lower speeds, higher prices, and less broadband network expansion across 40% of the U.S. landmass. This outcome undermines the great progress that has been enabled and achieved by these small companies leveraging the Universal Service Program to date. It's contrary to the universal service mandates of current law. Fortunately, 170 members of Congress, including members of this subcommittee, have already expressed concern to the FCC about how this affects rural consumers and communities, particularly prices for rural broadband that can remain twice as high as what urban consumers and businesses pay, if not even higher. We hold out hope, just like our members do, in continuing to try to build where they can, that Congress and the FCC will work together to make sure the promise of last year's USF reforms will be realized by the millions of Americans who badly need them to work. Given these impacts and the sustainability and effectiveness of the USF program is a top priority, but there are other issues of importance too. For example, as policymakers consider promoting infrastructure deployment, streamlining and standardizing access to federal lands would help greatly, especially for small businesses that lack the staff and resources to navigate multiple layers of federal agency process. Right-sized regulation is important too. A survey NTCA did in 2016 showed that our small business members have only 40 employees on average, but face just under 600 hours of burden, 73 workdays per year, in federal telecom regulatory reporting. We need to strike a better balance between heavy-handed regulation and, on the other hand, a complete lack of rules of the road that could put important goals like universal service and interconnection at risk. Finally, better compliance across federal agencies with the Regulatory Flexibility Act could help too. All too often, agencies undertake cursory RFA analyses that don't recognize the realities of operating as a small business. We see great promise in several bills that the full House has taken up, and we're eager to see those bills provide the guidance necessary to improve the RFA process and result in savings for small companies. We look forward to working with you on these important public policy initiatives and building upon the many successes these small businesses have had to date in deploying broadband in rural America. Thank you again for holding this hearing, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Romano. It's early. I'd like to recognize our next witness now, Mr. Osborne. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Blum, Ranking Member Snyder, and members of the subcommittees, I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on improving broadband deployment in rural America. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the VTX1 Companies, a rural telecommunications provider based in Raymondville, Texas. Detailed information on my company and my personal work history have been submitted with my written testimony. Today I'm representing our National Association, WTA, Advocates for Rural Broadband, on whose board of directors I serve. I intend to focus on three main areas where I think Congress can work with the regulators to facilitate broadband deployment in rural America. First is universal service policy. Without the support we and other rural telecom providers receive from the fund, our cooperative members would never be able to afford the services we provide. For many years, the FCC has tried to modernize the Universal Service Fund, first with the National Broadband Plan in 2010, which recommended freezing support at 2010 funding levels. These reform efforts culminated in a March 2016 order, which has resulted in companies like ours seeing their support reduced because of a budget reflecting the 2010 funding levels. We believe this approach attacks the problem from the wrong angle. Instead of setting the goal for broadband in rural America and attempting to determine what it would cost, the FCC has set an outdated budget and essentially said, see what you can do with this. Our federal USF from last year is down approximately $500,000, with greater reductions anticipated in light of the caps and constraints the FCC has placed on the high-cost fund. These federal support reductions have reduced our capital expansion within our Valley telephone service areas and slowed the conversion to fiber optic technology. It is important to upgrade our networks to fiber because a fiber network will have a service life several times that of a copper one, and the maintenance costs of a fiber network are much less than with copper. Additionally, serving the needs of cellular carriers with their forthcoming 5G LTE traffic will be very important. Instead of caps and cuts, the USF high-cost program needs at least an inflationary adjustment so that high-quality broadband can be pushed further into rural America. Second is streamlining our permitting processes for existing rights-of-way. Congress should review and reform the permitting process for access to federal lands and other right-of-ways. We wait several months and spend many thousands of dollars on projects for environmental, archaeological, and historical preservation reviews. Many have little value. For example, in 2010, VTX1 received a Broadband Technology Opportunity Program, or BTOP, grant to construct a fiber optic infrastructure for our universities. Our shovel-ready project had to wait 9 months to get environmental approvals needed to bore underneath the gravel right-of-way along 2 U.S. federal highways. Third, regulatory reporting burdens. We're concerned with the increased quantity of reporting obligations and burdens placed upon us involving regulatory reporting to the FCC, USAC, NECA, and other federal agencies when the recovery of these costs has been capped. BTCI performed a detailed wage analysis in 2016 and found that we spend around 3,200 hours completing just the federal reporting requirements placed upon us. This costs us about $100,000 a year in wages and another $50,000 a year in benefit costs alone, with none of these dollars being recovered by any federal support. A copy of our spreadsheet and study with our wage analysis is attached to my written testimony. Our conclusions are straightforward. First, the high-cost fund component of federal USF needs to continue in remote serving areas in the rural communities, as well as having a cost of living escalator to keep the fund viable during periods of inflation. An increase in high-cost fund money should be considered as well to speed up broadband deployment. Second, permitting timelines should be greatly reduced in areas and along roads where the land has been previously and continuously disturbed. Third, regulatory reporting should be streamlined and limited to items that have a significant measurable benefit to broadband deployment in America. That concludes my testimony. I await your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Osborne. Next, I'd like to recognize Mr. Donovan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Blum, Ranking Member Schneider, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify about improving mobile broadband deployment in rural America. This hearing is timely, Mr. Chairman, following the President's emphasis on rural broadband in your district yesterday. It's great to hear that you were able to join in person in 5G meetings at the White House today. CCA represents nearly 100 wireless carriers and nearly 150 vendors and suppliers. The vast majority of CCA's members are small businesses whose employees are the same consumers that live and work in the communities they serve. Mobile broadband use continues to increase exponentially. Ericsson recently forecasted a greater than 5-time increase in mobile data consumption over the next 5 years. Yet, a persistent digital divide continues to plague certain rural areas, leaving a subset of the nation trailing behind their urban counterparts on the road to 5G, including small businesses and entrepreneurs. As FCC Chairman Pai noted last week, we don't bemoan the digital divide because some people cannot play games like Candy Crush. Internet connectivity is vital to full participation in modern life. And as he articulated at the inaugural Rural Prosperity Task Force meeting, these policies are important for demonstrating that the federal government cares about rural America. Access to mobile broadband is not only a telecommunications issue. It is a jobs issue, an education issue, public health and safety issue, and an issue of America's competitiveness on the international stage. Simply put, the future of rural economic and small business growth and leading the world in 5G is directly tied to the availability of mobile broadband. CCA's members are proud to serve rural and remote parts of the country with the latest mobile broadband technologies. That means preserving and expanding 4G LTE today and upgrading to 5G. Policymakers can support rural broadband deployment through 3 key issues. First, the FCC plans to distribute nearly $5 billion for mobile deployment over the next decade through the Mobility Fund. But before the final eligible areas are set, we need better data. The current data is not standardized nor useful for determining where coverage gaps persist. Carriers know this, Congress has recognized this, and the FCC's website even acknowledges it. It boils down to coverage, and you know better than anyone else where in your district you have coverage and where you don't. But bad data means that your district could be ineligible for support through the Mobility Fund. And as an accurate coverage picture is developed, policymakers should ensure that the fund is sized to preserve and expand mobile broadband ubiquitously and ultimately meet Congress's mandate. Second, carriers must navigate a regulatory maze to deploy broadband infrastructure, meaning the towers, base stations, antennas, and wires that are the skeleton for mobile service. It is critical to support carriers' abilities to expand and densify their networks for uses like precision agriculture, an important technology for this subcommittee, telework opportunities, and economic growth for America's small employers. Yet the obstacles continue to multiply. In fact, each step on the chart you have before you highlights potential costs and delays for businesses. The bottom line is this: if we want to expand broadband throughout rural America and connect small entrepreneurs to the global economy, Siting processes must be streamlined at the local, state, and federal government levels. The same regulations for 400-foot towers should not apply to modern small cells. This committee should be a leader to ensure that policies enhance small businesses who have limited resources. To that end, the FCC deserves credit for establishing the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, in which CCA participates. This stakeholder group should work alongside Congress to produce uniform policies that advance infrastructure deployment. Finally, spectrum is the lifeblood of wireless networks, meaning that carriers must have access to low, mid, and high-frequency bands. In addition to deploying physical cells, carriers can enhance their network capacity by adding to their spectrum portfolios. The FCC recently completed the first ever incentive auction, where carriers bid nearly $20 billion for 600 megahertz band spectrum voluntarily relinquished by broadcasters. Around 30 of the winning bidders are CCA members. Now the FCC must act expeditiously to repack the band and make the spectrum available to the winning carriers so they can put their investment to use now, and certainly before the 39-month transition deadline. Carriers need greater access to spectrum at all frequencies to continue to innovate and invest in mobile solutions. While low-band spectrum is necessary to address network coverage gaps, especially in rural America, the capacity needed for 5G and next-generation technologies, which will be the foundation for transformative services, requires the use of mid- and high-band spectrum resources as well. Small businesses in rural America can no longer afford to be on the fringe of the industry's shift to next-generation networks, and policymakers are at the helm of this transition and can ensure that consumers in unserved and underserved areas are part of the 5G world. Policies established by Congress and implemented by the FCC determine whether small businesses in rural America have access to the latest services or are left behind the modern mobile economy. Competitive carriers want to be part of the solution. Thank you again for holding today's hearing, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Donovan. Now recognize Mr. Allendorf for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Schneider, and members of the committee for the opportunity to address you regarding Joe Carroll Energy's experience with rural broadband deployment. Our company was founded as an electric cooperative in 1939 as a result of the Rural Electrification Act. Today, we're a natural gas, broadband, and electric cooperative serving thousands of rural accounts across northwest Illinois. We're part of a broader electric cooperative industry that serves more than 40 million members nationwide over lines that cover more than half of our nation. Most of these members and lines are in rural America. Rural utility cooperatives are not-for-profit private businesses that operate under democratic principles, serving our members at cost. The goal of the REA was to bring electricity to rural Americans to ensure they enjoyed the same quality of life as those in urban areas, when others could not see a business case to do so. There is a similar situation happening right now with broadband in rural America. We serve fewer customers spread out over greater distances than more urban investor-owned utilities. Low customer density is important to keep in mind when considering large-scale deployment of broadband in rural America. In 2009, Joe Carroll began providing internet access to our members from a fixed wireless broadband system that we were utilizing for our electric and gas operations. Our hope was to bring higher speed broadband to rural subscribers than what was available, if anything, by leveraging our existing infrastructure. Our topography is challenging. We cover the highest terrain in Illinois down to river basins, and all of it through dense forests. We have not been able to reach as many people as we had hoped or offer the speeds that they need. Later, we transferred our internal network to fiber due to the need for reliable, high-speed broadband for our utility operations. Fiber provided low latency and consistent high speeds unaffected by our topography. Most importantly for us, it's scalable to meet our future utility demands. We sought to provide the same benefits to our members. Cost prohibited us from rolling out fiber to our entire service area, so we identified Galena, Illinois as an ideal site for a fiber pilot project. It's a rural town of 3,500 amid farmland near the Mississippi. It's the second most visited tourist attraction in Illinois after Chicago. That has created a robust hospitality and retail sector. Galena faces the same challenges as other rural areas regarding access to broadband. Service was only provided by cable companies or telcos over aging copper lines. Speed and reliability were big issues. Completed in 2016, our fiber project utilized existing overhead and underground utility infrastructure. Our take rate is over 60% among businesses in the project area. I've provided a few testimonials, but in summary, fiber has allowed businesses in the area to be more productive, more efficient, and increase sales, therefore creating the potential to expand their business. It's now common to see merchants in Galena using mobile bill pay and other productivity applications, which were not options before fiber broadband. For rural residents, high-speed broadband is not just about pastimes like Netflix, but more importantly, it's about a chance at a better living. Small businesses and farms are able to engage in commerce beyond their local area, which is a necessity in our global economy. It means rural students have the same access to high-quality education as their urban peers. It's critical for rural hospitals and clinics to provide modern patient care. And with experience in economic development, I can say it's one of the first things that businesses look at when deciding to locate in our area. Studies have shown that greater broadband connection in rural areas result in higher income and lower unemployment. Without reliable broadband, these businesses and farms are at a competitive disadvantage. It has become as much of a necessity as the gas and electric services that we provide. The President's stated goal of a large infrastructure program is laudable, but we need broadband as much, if not more, than roads and bridges in rural America. Rural broadband access needs a place of special importance in these discussions. Chairman Pai comes from a small Kansas town, and he has stated that government needs to rewrite regulations to cut red tape. He's created the Broadband Deployment Committee, presumably to do just that. As you consider proposals to spur broadband deployment, we believe that all potential providers, including electric cooperatives, should be eligible to participate in open and inclusive processes to compete for funding opportunities. We urge policymakers to consider the scope of capital needed to bring broadband to rural America. Along with our density challenges, access to capital is a major issue for a small company like us. We need more grant funding to make large-scale deployment viable in rural areas. Bringing electricity to rural America was a task of epic proportion, and our success in doing so has been called one of America's greatest achievements over the last 80 years. The government created a strong, lasting partnership with rural cooperatives to accomplish that goal, which resulted in the same high quality of life for all Americans, regardless of economics and location. Joe Carroll has seen that broadband access is essential for the continued success and well-being of rural America. It's our hope that Congress and this administration will build upon that partnership with support for the no less audacious goal of providing rural Americans with access to broadband service. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Allendorf. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions and answers. The first question I have is, anyone on the panel can jump in, but as a technological, somewhat neophyte, I'm continually amazed at the capacity of the system or the pipeline. I don't know if I'm using the right terms. I live in a rural area, and we have Netflix, we have Hulu, we have some of these other downloadable on-demand services coming via the pipeline out there. My question is, reaching the capacity of what it can handle, is that an issue that we're bumping up against continually? And the second part of the question is it an even bigger issue in rural areas, this capacity, as more people want to download TV services like Netflix and Hulu? Whoever wants to jump in, and please keep it in terms I can understand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll take a first crack at that.
Is your microphone on?
It should be. It is.
All right.
There we go. Thank you. Yeah, so the challenge we face is there's this tension between getting service to areas that are unserved and making sure that services are sufficient and robust enough to meet the challenges of broadband over the long haul. And that's a tension. It's a tough choice. It's not an easy one for policymakers or industry to work through. However, I think what you raised is a good point. As we're looking at this as an infrastructure challenge, one of the things we have to think about is building, these are assets that are intended to last for decades. And so if I were building a road and I had an anticipated level of traffic that was going to be coming across that road over the life of that asset, I wouldn't build it as a 2-lane road and then a few years later come back and make it a 4-lane road, then an 8-lane road. I'd have to go through all the permitting that CCA's chart, I think, demonstrates well all over again. You'd have to go through all these different challenges. So building a network up front for anticipated demand over the life of that asset, we would submit represents the most efficient use of resources to handle the kinds of capacity demands that you're expecting both now and into the future. Designing a network for 10.1, for example, when you know that just a few years ago it was 4.1 was the speed that was used, and today is 25.3, going to 100 megabits or a gigabit worth of speed and capacity over the life of that, over the use of that network, that sort of challenge is something that you have to engineer a network for up front to handle not only video and Netflix and things like that, but distance learning, telemedicine, all these applications that depend upon a robust network to make sure that you're going to attract healthcare, education, high-commerce businesses to these communities.
In your analogy, it probably makes it tougher because that 8-lane highway you mentioned hasn't been invented yet. So you have to design a system if you're trying to design it for 15 years from now, and things haven't even been invented that are going to be here 10 years from now, 7 years from now, 12 years from now, correct? I mean, it's a heck of a challenge.
It is. One of the benefits, I think, of some of the systems we're moving towards with both fiber and 5G, which I see as actually very integrated pieces of the puzzle, because 5G is driven in large part, the capacity, the promise of 5G is driven by a densified fiber network. If you have fiber and you're moving towards 5G, you are starting to build for the ability to adjust, upgrade the network, scale it over time to respond to the kinds of demands. So you may not have invented that electronics yet that will deliver the speeds that we might see in the future, but you've at least laid the groundwork, the foundation to scale it for the things that might come, to be in the best position to answer those calls.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we need fiber as a building block to all of these technologies that are being talked about today, like 5G. Rural areas simply don't have the infrastructure to utilize these technologies like 5G. And as we've seen firsthand, we need a robust fiber infrastructure to, as Mr. Romano made the analogy, plan for the future and be able to handle the demands that will come from that. We've seen that firsthand.
So the future is fiber? Is it ever going to get to the point where we don't need something buried under the ground? We don't even need the fiber, or is that, well,
so it's hard to imagine that, but the future is in part built on fiber. I'll say that.
The consumer isn't gonna plug into something, is where the future's going. The delivery vehicle is gonna be wireless, and to add capacity to wireless network, it's twofold. It's building more towers, and that's where all of the challenges and red tape in deploying new infrastructure are a big issue. But it's also adding spectrum to your network. And for your question on rural areas and specifically, that's why this incentive auction spectrum is so important. It covers a very long distance. Think wherever you could pick up a broadcast TV signal. That's the same bandwidth that's been repurposed for wireless use. That's going to be 5G in rural areas. We need to make sure that carriers that bid and won that spectrum can put it to use to serve your constituents.
How much was raised in that auction?
Nearly $20 billion. So, about $10 billion of that goes to the Treasury for deficit reduction. About $12 billion went to the broadcasters to compensate them for moving off the spectrum.
You just answered my next question. Thank you very much. My time is up, and go ahead, Mr. Osmar.
I was just going to make a point. You mentioned, what do you do when you run out of bandwidth? Any given time of day, we run between 40 and 50% of our traffic is either Netflix or Amazon Prime. The internet is not about email anymore. It's about video. And video takes massive amounts of bandwidth, particularly when everyone does it at the same time. We buy more. We have between 3 and 5 upstream Tier 1 internet providers that we connect to so that we're never down. But we're selling 10 times what we did 5 years ago. When I took this job in 2005, 1.5 meg of internet was a big deal. That was big stuff. We offer gigabit service in our fiber exchanges. That's 1,000-fold, and they're talking picabit for fiber in 2020. And I thought, wait a minute, something's missing. Terabit. What happened to terabit? They're skipping that. So this 25.3, my God, we can do that on a tin can and a string. It's fiber. The capacities of fiber are unknown. You ask any engineer, and they'll tell you they don't know what the capacities are. They're that vast. Wireless it's applied physics, and when you take that down and say no matter how fast the wireless go, theoretically the fiber will always go faster. So we see it as both. We offer fixed wireless service, and we can give up to 50 megabits on wireless with a dish on the top of your roof. But we see it as a future of both. We need the wireless to reach customers that it's not economical to build to, and they need us to transport these huge amounts of data, because 5G LTE is going to have, depending on how far you are from the tower, up to a gigabit worth of service. That's huge, absolutely huge.
Thank you. Tin can and a string. Now it's something I can understand. Thank you for bringing it down to my level, and probably a few folks out there as well. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Snyder from Illinois. 5 minutes.
Thank you, and again, thank you to the witnesses for your insightful testimony. Mr. Romano, you used the term that I want to focus on a little bit, which is future-proof, because the rate of technology is changing. And Mr. Osborne, you just touched on something. There is a leapfrog effect. Well, it's not really a leapfrog, going from mega to giga to pico, skipping tera. Just the pace is so fast. Fiber is a connection, but we need to have the ability to keep it up to date across the rural communities. We're talking 5G. What's the life expectancy of each generation? Because we've already gone through 1, 2, 3, and 4G.
Yeah, this is the thing that, especially both on the wireline and the wireless side, I think we're seeing massive amounts of disruption in the technology. The electronics change, the uses of the spectrum change in a way that could not be predicted years ago. I mean, you think about it. 15 years ago, actually, I worked at America Online. AOL used to get those discs, right? I mean, things moved by DVD and CD at that point. Now we're moving at a pace that's unimaginable. But I think to your question, we can't anticipate exactly what will come. But I mean, I know that 5G. We haven't even seen what 5G is yet. It's still, the standards for it are still being developed. People are talking about deploying 5G. They're kind of guessing and marketing what 5G is, but we actually don't know what those standards are. The best thing we can do is get networks into place that are scalable. That if we have a limited, finite pool of resources, what's the best amount use we can make of those resources? We could try to spread them thinly and hope that the networks we build will keep up, or we could try to think through how do we make the best use of these so that over time, those networks where they're built, they're not just there for the one-time act of getting broadband there, it's keeping it there and keeping it useful and enabling 5G, enabling terabit service and greater over time.
So real briefly, just because we're so tight on time, Mr. Donovan, you used a word that caught my attention, which is densify. As we move to these next generations, does it mean that we're going to have to increasingly densify the modular parts of the networks, the towers, everything else?
Yes, so thank you for the question. Densification means bringing the transmitters for the wireless network closer to where the users are. So it's a lot fewer of the 400, 500-foot towers and more cell sites that are about this big that you could put up on the side of a building on existing light poles and using existing infrastructure. That's what is going to be a big part of 5G. To follow up on kind of the generational shifts in wireless technology, 5G is not a replacement for 4G services. And that's why it's so important that we have a base layer of 4G rolled out today while industry is still working on the standards for 5G. In rural areas, there's still 2G networks that are operational because people are still using those. So it's not that one technology replaces the other, it's that we keep evolving and adding on top. And it's important for rural America to keep up with their Gs if we want to keep giving them the latest services.
And let me just add to that, as we broadly think about rural America, it is the breadbasket of our country. It provides a vast quantity of our food. It is where we are developing new technologies. It's not that these are backwaters. It defines who we are as a country. And Mr. Allendorf, I want to turn to you because you grew up where you work. You've seen the impact of broadband. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the effects you've seen and the opportunities created by bringing broadband to a community like where you live?
I didn't have experience with broadband until I went to college in the early 2000s. Before that, we had dial-up. And so getting to college and seeing what broadband can do for the first time was pretty eye-opening. What we've seen is, anecdotally, businesses are able to do more with the resources they have at hand. They're able to utilize productivity software, like I mentioned. It's really enabled them to truly compete in a global economy. They don't have to drive to the nearest really good site for a broadband connection to transact business or something like that. And it's just increased their productivity overall. So the effects that we've seen, especially in our fiber pilot project area, are immense compared to what was there before. And I would say that they didn't know what they had until they had it because it wasn't an option before. And now that they do, they're finding new and creative ways to be more productive.
Well, as my time winds down, not having broadband until college, I will tell you I got to college with card decks, so you can overcome these challenges in life. But that is the rate of our technology. I'll also share that early in my career, worked on developing software initially for the oil and gas industry. We migrated it to agriculture into these rural communities. This was back in the 1980s. We saw the revolutionary impact it was having then. Today with broadband, as you well know, these communities, to be able to bring technology for agriculture, for medicine, for education, distance learning, the future is unlimited, but it can't be unlimited unless we provide the resources to these communities. So thank you very much, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I represent a very rural district in Kentucky. It's a very poor district. We have a very high Medicaid population. I want to see people get off Medicaid and get into the workforce. To do that in my rural district, we're going to have to create an environment where we can attract better paying jobs that provide benefits. One of the biggest issues for me as a freshman member of Congress is to try to help improve broadband in my rural district. So I'm very interested in this subject. Mr. Allendorf, since your primary focus has been delivering electricity, can you talk a little bit about the regulatory obstacles that other folks on the panel may not have when building out their broadband capacity? Because we're going to have to do that, I would assume, through the electric cooperatives and the rural electric cooperatives in our district.
First, let me say that with our fiber project, we were able to utilize existing infrastructure much more than we were with fixed wireless solutions. So it requires less permitting, which is always a concern, both locally and from the state. So being able to use our overhead and underground infrastructure is a huge benefit. Regulatory challenges we face, pole attachments, something that always comes up. That's an issue. There's a federal case out of Missouri that dealt with pole attachments for fiber use by a cooperative. I believe that's currently still on appeal. We're anxiously waiting to see what the result of that is, to see what barriers there may be going forward to deploying broadband over our existing infrastructure.
Okay. Mr. Donovan, what kinds of reforms could help alter the outlook for a company interested in deploying broadband?
Thank you for the question. In Kentucky, carriers like Bluegrass Wireless and Appalachian Wireless.
Cellular carrier.
It's a great company out of Elizabethtown there. We're proud to have them as a member. One challenge that wireless carriers are facing now is the FCC's Mobility Fund has a lot of opportunity, making resources available to make that last piece of the economic case to serve these rural areas. The biggest problem we have right now is the data. The map that they show on their website overstates coverage, and you have to take my word for it. It says at the bottom, these coverage calculations have certain limitations that result in overstatement of the extent of mobile coverage. Looking at it quickly, it looks like all of Iowa, most of Illinois, most of Kentucky, on down the line are fully served. I think, that's probably not the case, or else we wouldn't be here today talking about how we can get service out there. Before we decide, how $5 billion is going to be spent over the next decade and lock those areas out, we need to make sure that we're acting on sound data so that the unserved parts of your district are eligible to bid in that auction and gain support.
If Congress moves on an infrastructure bill with money for broadband, should that money go through the high-cost fund or through other programs or agencies such as RUS or NTIA?
So we have structures that are put in place through the FCC, like Mobility Fund. I think there's a unanimous agreement of the panel that USF is not fully funded today, so this could be a great opportunity to plus that up. The thing to also consider that is making sure that however the funds go out, that carriers that are receiving those can have some long-term certainty that those are going to be available, that you're not subjected to some of the fits and starts of the appropriations process moving forward.
Okay, very good. Mr. Romano, one last question here for you. Would it be better to get everybody connected even if it's at lower speeds, or should we focus on the future and invest more in developed technology? What's the right balance on that?
Thank you, Mr. Comer. That's the challenge that we faced, as I mentioned earlier, the tension that we face between trying to get the unserved, as many of the unserved covered as possible. However, if you're building a dirt road to everybody when you think you're going to have a lot of traffic there, you're potentially wasting resources. So we think it's best to try to strike a balance where you look to get the most future-proof networks you can, aim for the highest networks you can to as many people as possible. It may take a little bit of time, but the more we build for the future, the more we're going to attract the kinds of jobs and businesses that you were talking about. Somebody's not going to relocate a plant to a district to connect it to DSL.
Right. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Comer. I'd now like to recognize for 5 minutes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Luke DeMeyer, who is also the vice chairman of our full small business committee. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the guests who are here today. Like the other members of the committee, I come from a very, very rural part of my state. In fact, I always tell people I live so far out that I'm in the middle of nowhere, but when you get there, you're finally somewhere. And so when I have discussions with telecom companies, I always tell them, you know what, I live so far back the river, you can get me broadband and all that sort of stuff, then you come talk to me. Until then, I've got a lot of constituents that got problems. If you can't serve me and them, we don't need to talk. So this is a very, very important hearing, and I appreciate the chairman's indulgence here. Also, in my county, our county seat sits right square in the middle of our county, and until about a year ago, didn't even have cell phone service. Can you imagine that? Didn't even have cell phone service in our county seat. So the sheriff, obviously, he had no ability to contact his deputies on a regular cell phone, and had to find other ways to communicate with him with his other phones, which is fine, but I mean, it just shows the difficulties that some of us in the rural parts of the country live through. So I guess my question would be to each of you and some of you, what can we do as a committee to help promote or do whatever we need to do to help all of you provide the broadband and the telecommunications services that our people, our businesses, our health providers in our part of the world need to be able to do their job and protect our citizens. And I know that, I guess the first question is, how do you speed up the regulations? And I know more money is always added, but when you do that, I want to know, how do you estimate the return on your investment? Because I can tell you, you know, I grew up a long, long time ago. I remember the old TV show Get Smart, and the guy had a phone in his shoe. And today I've got two phones sitting right here that when I grew up, that was a fantasy. How can you have a phone without a line to connect it to the rest of the world? And yet today it's a convenience we can't live without. So I understand the difficulty that you have in predicting the future, which you talked about, and how you make that investment, how you figure out that return on investment. So if you kind of go into some of that, I'd appreciate it. And then I'd like to go to Mr. Donovan, I believe, with regards to the data. So let me stop and let you answer some questions.
Sure, well, thank you. And sounds like the county seat would be a perfect place for some small cells to go up on some of the existing poles, build out service in there. The problem in these rural areas, as this committee knows, is the margins are already very tight for small carriers to serve them. And the opportunity costs of fees that you pay to site them, especially on small cells, if it's the same fees you're paying to build a massive tower, could be enough to make it so it's no longer economical to provide that service. So anything we can do to streamline the process to get some of those fees in line is going to help us be able to expand service in areas like that.
Okay, how do you figure the return on your investment? How do you work the numbers on that? Do you figure 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20, 25? What kind of time frame do you look at when you figure out the return on your investment?
So it does vary carrier to carrier. One thing that is exciting in the wireless world is that the future customers may not be, yourself sitting here with two phones, two lines of service, but it could be your tractor in the field, each head of cattle that's out there that's being remotely monitored. There's new Internet of Things customers that are changing the equation that you do for your cost-benefit analysis. But that's only going to happen if we have the networks in place to support that. Otherwise, the investment is going to flow elsewhere. If you don't streamline how we can invest in those areas, then those areas are going to miss, and it's going to go to places that it's easier to make those deployments.
Anybody else want to comment? Mr. Marmon?
I'll jump in. Thank you, Congressman. So I think the challenge, or one of the things I think what this panel has in common actually, is we all represent or all associated with community-based providers. So one of the things that is interesting when you look at ROI is if you live in that community, if you're based in that community, you have a different view perhaps of ROI than if you're investing from far away. Because if you're investing from far away, or you have allegiance or have to fiduciary duties to faraway shareholders, that creates a very different circumstance than when you're looking at, you've got to get your money out because you've got capital in. In this case, some of these loans these folks are taking out are 20-year loans, so therefore the ROI is very different. They're also, again, headquartered in the community. They might be cooperatives that actually their members are their owners.
Okay, one more quick question before I lose my time here. Mr. Donovan, you talked about the study to make sure that you have the data there to be able to make sure you disperse the funds where it's needed. Number one, who does the study? And number two, who pays for it?
Thank you. So the data, it's required by the FCC to be submitted by carriers. So far so good. Okay. The problem is the FCC doesn't tell carriers how to standardize that data. So you could have one carrier that's reporting at a signal strength that varies dramatically from another carrier. The calculation that they do, we won't go into them.
You need some better direction from the FCC then on the reporting of this data. Is that what you need?
We need to make it standardized.
Standardized. Okay. Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. You go back.
Thank you, Mr. Lukemeyer. I now recognize the gentleman from the great state of Iowa for 5 minutes, Mr. King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing and taking the lead on this issue. Just listening to the remarks of my friend and neighbor to the south, Mr. Lukemeyer, whose district I have visited, and he lives in the middle of nowhere, and I live in the center of the hub of the wheel in the middle of nowhere. He has cell phone. I have cell phone coverage. He does not. And so I'm sitting here listening, thinking, why is that the case for me and not for Mr. Lukemeyer and many of his constituents? One is hills. The degree of difficulty is a lot greater if you've got hoops and valleys rather than the flatter countryside that predominates a lot of the great state of Iowa. That's part of it. But another part of it, I think, and I wanted to ask the question, whoever wants to volunteer to answer it, is that in Iowa we had, as last time I kept track, about 142 independent telcos, and I know that they're more personally connected with their customers than the more remote, larger companies. And the map says that Iowa's in pretty good shape. There are exceptions there, Mr. Donovan, and you pointed that out. But how much impact has it had to have a large number of competitive independent telcos that are neighborhood telephone companies using everything they can to make that pipe as big as possible for the long-term future of their neighbors and relatives?
It's critically important, Congressman, and like my colleague Mr. Romano mentioned, being in the community makes a difference as you make decisions about where you're going to invest and where you're going to serve. When you have to see your consumers, not just in the office when they come to your store, but in the grocery store and around the community. So that changes how you make your investment decisions. One success story in Iowa is that rural carriers like iWireless have been able to band together some of those smaller independent operators so that you can have some scale, so that you can gain access to buy devices. If you don't get to some of those scale levels, like across many issues for small businesses, if you can't deliver enough scale, then you can't get access to economically priced resources that you need. For wireless service, that's the devices, it's the network infrastructure, it's the things you have to build to provide that service.
And so, at least in my theory, if other states were beneficiaries of a lot of more competitive, a lot of times family-owned telcos, we might have seen a better build-out here in broadband. So the resources have been there for everybody equally. Was that true?
Not always the case, unfortunately. In the wireless world, so spectrum is our primary resource. You're not making any more of them. You need to get it from license from the government. Different spectrum bands are made available differently. One thing that's important for small businesses, if the license size isn't sufficiently small for a small business to be able to bid on it, win it, and provide service, then they're not going to be able to get access to that critical resource, and they won't be able to provide service.
And that applies to the license size applies, and then also the ability to have the infrastructure built that can handle the capacity into the future. I just a narrative popped into my head when I heard that. As I recall that when I had a construction office in town for a number of years, and it was fed by a 3/4-inch water line underneath the highway, a very wide highway with a long boring project to replace it. I went to the city and said, I can't provide water out of my place to the blacksmith who's next door to me, and he's trapped if I don't get it to him. We need to expand this water line. I made a powerful case they should do that. I finally sold them on the idea, and they let me go up to 1 inch from 3/4. And so I finally, out of frustration, said, I'll put the water line in, and I bought the 2-inch line, and now everybody's living happily ever after on that one. That's how I equate with what you're talking about. Let's well overbuild this, because the actual cost of the equipment is minimal in comparison to the cost of the labor to do the installation process. I wanted to turn to Mr. Romano and give you an opportunity to say whatever you need to say, but I also have a question. We have some neighbors, and myself included, that use cell phone boosters in our homes. Mm-hmm. Is there a future for that, or are they minimal in their ability to have impact?
No, I think they will have impact. I think they can. Wireless and wired service, I think, are in many respects complementary, both at the network level and the access level. You know, a lot of times you see people talk about how much mobile data consumption there is. People are using tablets more to connect to devices. A lot of times those mobile tablet devices are actually, in fact, hopping onto a wired network, a Wi-Fi network. These are complementary integrated networks that are going to need each other, I think, to thrive and survive and serve the needs of a community like you're talking about. I did want to come back to the one point you made about local community interest, ownership, family-owned businesses, cooperatives working together. We've actually started an initiative with a number of folks trying to get telcos and electric co-ops who have a shared interest in serving these communities together, bring broadband expertise together with the assets, community interest of the electric cooperatives and municipalities and tribal entities even. Think about different ways of tackling these so that we can make the most efficient, most effective use of resources on the ground level.
Is it our future, to anybody that wants to answer this, is it our future that everybody in America eventually will have access, not only in the undefined broadband, is for me, I didn't hear that in the, but is it our future that we'll be able to do live stream HD anywhere, anytime for anybody with a cell phone or sitting in their home with their television? Is that where we're going to end up? With an unlimited capacity beyond our imagination today, I should say, not unlimited, to go beyond that if need be?
It could be, but what you're going to need is the small cell deployment that's robust enough, fed by fiber networks that are robust enough, and spectrum assets that are robust enough to hit those small cells. Again, why I say it's all integrated, but it could be there, but you're going to need those small cells every few hundred feet, which is a big challenge in rural America, with robust enough spectrum or fiber capacity behind them to feed the kinds of demands that you're talking about. But that's the dream, at least.
We can get there. And they'd love to have this on Apollo 13. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. King. I'd like to start the second round of questioning, if I could. Somebody mentioned having, I guess, transmitters on phone poles, telephone poles. Kind of reminds me of the concept of the democratization of the electrical grid, that if each home in America, or particularly in rural America, could generate our own electricity, we could sell some of that electricity back to the power companies, and in essence, we'd be democratizing the electrical grid. This concept fascinates me. Could this possibly be an answer in rural America for wireless? Is to have every farm, every home, my home, for example, could not only receive but could also maybe transmit to the next home, not back to the tower, but to the next home, and we'd have this interrelated network. Because I've heard of this very thing for aircraft, and if every aircraft that's in the air we know their position, and if they can communicate with each other, then we have this grid, and so there'd be no dark spots or black spots over the ocean, for example, that currently we can't capture with radar. It fascinates me, the concept. Could you comment on that?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman, and you're right that we are going to need those cell sites brought that close to you so you can have that kind of mesh network that doesn't have any gaps. The problem right now
is network, is that what that's called, mesh network?
That is, it's mesh networking. But right now you probably aren't going to go through the process to work with a carrier to put up a cell site on the side of your house if it means that you're going to have to do a new environmental review to see whether you disturbed anything when you built that house, to go through a new historical review. We need to cut through some of that.
Remove the word probably.
Well, exactly, and that means that you won't have that cell site available. So
today, in today's environment, that's what it would entail.
That's right. That chart, you would have to go through every step of this in order to put that cell site up on the side of your building.
But a fascinating concept,
Absolutely.
Nonetheless.
And the densification that we need to provide that service going forward.
And my second and last question is for Mr. Osborne. And Mr. Donovan just mentioned the regulations. Regulatory burden is a big topic in Washington, D.C. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Osborne, with the change in leadership at the FCC, with Chairman Pai coming in, have you seen any indications that the FCC is serious about reducing the regulatory burden in this industry, particularly as it relates to rural areas?
Thank you. Yes, we have. It's the first few months have been very encouraging. What Chairman Pai seems to be very sensitive to is the red tape and the regulations. I understand there is and I mentioned the permitting process that we were involved with, and I understand there is a bill S604 that would essentially give a categorical exclusion to environmentals along operational rights-of-way. That type of legislation would help quite a bit in removing some of the regulatory issues, and I call environmental regulatory. But that would speed things up greatly, reduce cost, and I think make things more efficient in laying fiber. Once you lay fiber, it's there forever. We lay our fiber in double plow ducts, undisturbed. We go down as far as we can, 6 feet, 8 feet if we can, and we run it. Once it's there, we can replace it without having to dig. So that investment, we can look at that as a 20-year rate of return. We've got to replace the electronics every 3 to 5 years. So that's the one where we've got to get our money out of that quickly. The wireless, same thing. So when the rate of returns that we're trying to work toward varies largely by the technology. But the regulatory issues more faces with the terrestrial piece of it. I mentioned the reports that we have to do. If we saw value in this, I think it would be different. Mapping is a big part of our business. We have maps of everything in our serving areas, about 10,000 square miles of serving area. And to deal with the FCC's requirements to go down to the census block, I can show you those census blocks in my map. I shouldn't have to do a separate report and essentially duplicate what I've paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for in a software system to come up with a report. I have the information. All they have to do is ask for it, and that would help greatly in terms of moving things along.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to recognize the gentleman from the great state of Nebraska, Mr. Bacon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I apologize for coming in just a little bit late, but 2 other simultaneous meetings, so we're running around. I used to be raised on a farm until 1985, joined the Air Force, but my main problem of getting some kind of linkage prior to 1985 was finding that AFM or AM radio so I could listen to the Chicago Cubs, play at 120. In the military too, we're starting to do every aircraft, receiving, and sending various links. And what's impressed me is now that I'm out of the Air Force and I'm starting to work more with the ag community again, and talking to my family, it's just so impressive that all the new combines, all the new tractors are all just sending out all these links. Our irrigation systems are doing the same. Just phenomenal. Now, you may have already mentioned this, and I may have missed it, so I apologize if you did. What is the actual scope of investment that we need in our country, nationwide, to feel this the way we want to? And I'll just open it up to whoever can respond.
So thank you, Congressman. It's an evolving level. We need to make sure we're keeping up with everything, but you hit on an important point. There's been a lot of talk in D.C. recently about connected cars. Well, in farms, we've had those for a while. They're combines and they're tractors, but they're using those connections. So CostQuest has done one model of what it would take to have wireless coverage across the country to power all of those things, and they came in at about $25 billion.
$25 billion.
With a B. With about another $1 billion in operational costs once you have it built, just to keep it going in areas that private capital won't sustain.
And that gives us the capability for all of our newest equipment to be able to communicate with maintenance facilities, and so all that networking that's going on. So you would get that capability. What other capability would that provide our agriculture?
So you would have more efficient, the combines, the tractors are connected. Their maintenance schedules. They tell you before they break down that you need to get someone out there. You can more efficiently use resources. What fields need water, what needs what going on. But you also have real-time connections to markets, and when it's time to harvest certain amounts of the yields. So your productivity goes up overall as well as profitability of the farm.
Right. I think that's incredible. Are there certain portions of our country right now that need this more than others? Are there areas that were more advanced? Is there some portions of the country that were falling behind?
You know, I think for different use cases, we need this nationwide. You know, you probably aren't going to be using a tractor on a mountain, but you still are going to want to be connected so you can take part in other, you know, educational and business opportunities.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the time, and I can just second the importance of it because my family that's still involved in the farming, when you go out there and they're using GPS, and I had the most curviest rows when I was a 16-year-old out there. Now you don't have to drive it at all. It's perfectly straight. So thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bacon. And I'll recognize our ranking member, Mr. Snyder from Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I won't be long and take the full time. I just want to wrap up on a couple things. You do use tractors on a mountain, by the way. Growing up in Colorado, ski areas are seriously using those for maintaining their slopes during the winter. So this is something that affects us all across the country. And Mr. Donovan, I'll go back to something else you said. You talked about the idea that, you know, the Internet of Things, the idea that every head of cattle will have a device that is sending back information about that individual cattle, which means our food will be healthier, our cost to produce that food will be lower, and the impact it has, again, across the whole nation. So I really just want to give each of you a last chance for a reflective comment, perhaps. As we talk about providing rural communities with broadband access, which was the subject of this meeting, this is something that I believe really is of national interest. It doesn't affect just our rural communities, it affects all of us regardless of where we live. And so, start with you, Mr. Romano, just the last word of why this is important to our nation and why it deserves a national investment.
So thank you, Congressman. The Hudson Institute did a study a couple of years ago showing that the payback from investment in rural broadband, just from the active investment in rural broadband, not the follow-on effects of rural broadband, were $24.1 billion in 2015 to the national economy, with much of that accruing back to urban areas, actually because of the vendors and contractors that are hired to build this stuff and the tower manufacturers and what have you. So there's that direct impact. There's the indirect impact, of course, of the mission of universal service was first sort of thought of last century and embodied in different forms throughout, but the network effect of our country is stronger and better and more efficient and effective if every American's connected. And that's one of the things I think that's important in the concept of universal service. We have a lot of folks who focus on, let's connect this type of institution, this type of customer, this type of user. We need community-wide access to all of them. To focus on any one type of user and silo it in that way, I think undercuts the notion of universal service. We should be asking the folks who are out there building to build to every user, irrespective of what kind of user they are, so that everybody gets the benefit of that network effect, which is why we're building these networks in the first place.
Thank you. Just a quick word on the Hudson Institute study. It didn't come as a great surprise to us because we have communities where it's an hour and a half to the nearest Walmart, hour and a half to the nearest Best Buy, you name it. So, boy, you can get on there to go to Amazon 2 days, right, and buy and purchase. So rather than run into town, people will, that's how they do their commerce, is get on that internet and make purchases, and that adds up. Oh my, you get it. You totally get it. You totally get it. The other topic, though, we're part of a world economy, and somebody mentioned we're number 16. I think that's pitiful.
That was me.
Of course, number 1 through 15, the telecommunications infrastructure is probably owned by the government. That's the common model. The U.S. is the exception to that, with the formation of AT&T 100 years ago. If we're going to be competitive with India, with China, with the rest of the world, we're going to have to kick it up a notch, and we're going to have to bite the bullet and put some money in it, not just in rural, but in the, I hate to say this because I'm here for rural, but you're going to have to put the money everywhere, right, and get us competitive, and it needs to flow out to the rural areas because they're doing some important stuff. That's where food, water, and oil come from.
Fair point.
That we need.
Mr. Donovan.
Well, first, I'd associate myself with my colleagues' comments on the economic impact. It's incredible to see what a multiplier it is bringing broadband services out to these areas. I guess I'd close that Congress got it right, directing the FCC that we will have policies for reasonably comparable.
Will you just repeat that again?
Absolutely. On Universal Service Fund, in 1996, Congress got it right, directing the FCC to have reasonably comparable services in an evolving standard in urban and rural areas. We need to make sure we're putting policies in place to make sure that that's the case on the ground.
And the last word to you, Mr. Allendorf.
Thank you, Congressman. Building on Mr. Donovan's comments, Congress got it right with rural electrification as well. And it's going to take that kind of commitment from Congress, from the administration, to bring broadband to rural areas. And it's going to take partnerships with many different industries to do that. And I would encourage that kind of broad thinking, as you've done today, in achieving rural broadband deployment. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to steal a few extra seconds, if that's okay, just to reflect on your comments, because I think as we're here talking about what broadband can do and the comments you made, three things jump out at me. If we get this right again, we can grow our economy. At a time of great division in our country, broadband can unite us, and it is necessary, Mr. Osborne, what you said. If we are going to, as a nation, lead the world economically in a global economy, lead the world with information, lead the world with our values, this is a step towards that. So I just want to thank the witnesses again and thank the chairman for having this hearing. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. I noticed today you mentioned you used to carry around punched cards and work for Sears Catalog. So I must say I think you're younger looking than obviously you are. But thanks for sharing that with us. It makes me feel better. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Lukemeyer for 5 minutes from Missouri. Fine. Are there any further questions anyone has? If not, then I'd like to thank each of our panelists for taking the time today to testify. It's truly fascinating. As this hearing comes to a close, I hope that we've opened some eyes, certainly I've opened mine, and educated a few folks about how important advanced telecommunications services are to our nation's rural small businesses and how important it is to create a positive regulatory environment for the businesses represented on our panel. I'm heartened to hear that the FCC has begun to make things a little more user-friendly for folks like our witnesses today, but more must be done. These small businesses are ready, willing, able, and frankly itching to get out there and build these networks, if only Washington, D.C. would get out of their way. I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record, and without objection, so ordered, and we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
I also worked on the